lecture of our year. Congratulations. You guys have done an awesome job. And I know it's not what any of us would have expected, but you guys have made the best of it. And I hope that the information that I'm presenting today, although vague and general and quick, will get you interested in some of these topics. And if it's something that you want to learn more about, please let me know. So this is just kind of a quick rundown of reform movements of the 1960s and 70s. And throughout, I'm going to drop some ideas that you might choose to focus on for your Unit 13 project. We've already covered the civil rights movement. All of that is fair game. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the women's movement, just because kind of in order it starts a little bit earlier. So this comes out of what was referred to as the problem with no name. The idea that women's lives were secondary and kind of solitary, and that women who were not in a position to be able to have a creative life of their own or a professional life of their own, that was the problem with no name. Now comes forward during this period, and the term feminism. And feminism is commonly defined as believing in the equality of the sexes, that men and women are inherently equal. Gloria Steinem comes to the forefront. She's actually, of all of these, she's still alive. And Ms. Magazine. And it was kind of a pushback against other women's magazines that were about women's appearance or cooking, and instead it was more about women's empowerment. The Equal Rights Amendment, which would have provided women equal pay under the law federally, which was voted down in 1972. It still doesn't exist, and women still are not guaranteed fair pay. And then Title IX, which provides an equivalent women's sport for every men's sport at least within the college system. So for each of these kind of quick rundowns that I've got here, I've chosen some primary sources to support or to give you a little more information. So in 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is published, and it's so dense, and there's a lot going on in it. So I've excerpted some excerpts for you. Um, if you want to pause and give it a read through, pause now, and then I'll give you a little bit of analysis. So this is really where it starts. It says this problem, the problem that has no name, lay buried, and it wasn't talked about. That women who were these kind of like housewives that we think of in the 1950s, that they weren't happy, that this was all that their lives were about, and they were asking themselves this question: is this all? In the 15 years after World War II, the idea that women were fulfilled simply by what she describes here um, is going to become challenged. Millions of women live their lives in the image of those pretty pictures of the American suburban housewife. So she's basically saying here that like women were unhappy with this role, but there's really no way to break out of this role. So here she goes on to talk about how young women, especially, are sort of trained to accept being treated in a certain way. And here she basically gives her advice. It would be a great service to tell girls who plan to work in a society to expect this uncomfortable discrimination. Don't tell them to be quiet, tell them to fight it. And then she goes on to say that women and girls should not expect special privileges, but that doesn't mean adjusting to prejudice and discrimination. And for some of the roots of Title IX, which might be something that you're interested in, looking at women's sports or maybe equal pay in women's sports, looking at the women's soccer team, for example, that might be something that you choose to do your Unit 13 assessment on. I'm going to give you a little bit more about the student movement. It's closely associated with the anti-war movement, initially with the civil rights movement, like we looked at, looking at the free speech movement at Berkeley. Things get pretty out of hand at Columbia. There's actually like a riot. And there are some members of this organization, Students for a Democratic Society, which is sort of seeing a resurgence, which is really interesting. That although you'll see in the source, they do not support violence, there becomes this kind of radical wing of SDS. And a couple of them, when building bombs, actually blow themselves up by accident. SDS is founded by this guy, Tom Hayden, and the founding document is called the Port Huron Statement. We're going to look at that on the next slide. So he's really looking at like people who came of age in the post-World War II society and looking at the way the world is now. He's going to be, or SDS is sort of the start of what's called the New Left, these sort of younger Democrats that are becoming more and more involved. So this is excerpted from the Port Huron Statement. There are 6 central values. I've only included one of them because there's a lot going on in this document. Pause, and then I will give you a little bit of analysis. So here he's talking about how the idea here is that everything involved politically, economically, and he really focuses on the university system, should be organized to increase the dignity of man. Any social change, we find violence to be abhorrent. That's going to change a little bit. It is imperative that the means of violence be abolished and that the institutions that encourage nonviolence be developed. So that's one of the really interesting things about SDS. And then number 5, so here's that New Left. He's saying that in order to be successful, the New Left, these young Democrats that are more radical than the traditional Democrats, that they need to start controversy. And that the only way to get people to pay attention is to be a little bit radical. So there are groups today that are perceived as radical that you may want to look at for your Unit 13 assessment. And then here he talks about how if we appear to seek the unattainable, as it has been said, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the unimaginable. I have a counterpoint. This actually came out first. This is the Sharon Statement, and it was put together by a group called Young Americans for Freedom. So where SDS is the New Left, Young Americans for Freedom are sort of the new right. They're young conservatives, and they are challenging the norms, as all youth movements did, of the conservative movement. Youth movements during this period are not limited to only being left or liberal. There's also conservative movements. So this is the Sharon Statement. Give it a pause, give it a read, and then I'll give you some analysis. So I've started you here. This is actually the very beginning. This is the first sort of 3 paragraphs. In this time of moral and political crises, it is the responsibility of the youth of America to affirm certain eternal truths. And you'll notice that there's a cadence here that should be familiar to you, going back to the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. There's some of those same ideas. Transcendent values, God-given free will. You'll notice that in the Port Huron Statement, there's nothing particularly religious, but you'll see that here. And then it also gets back into our 1950s sort of mindset. The forces of international communism are the greatest threat to the liberties of the United States. And there's some stuff that I've excerpted in between, but it talks about how, capitalism, the market economy, these ideas of personal freedom and the interpretation of the Constitution, and that the United States should stress victory over rather than coexistence with this menace being communism. So you might want to look at, for your Unit 13 assessment, traditional interpretations of the Constitution, groups that are pro-capitalism, anti-communism, or maybe the way that that's seen today is anti-socialist. That might be something that you want to look at. And then here's the closing. That foreign policy must be judged by this criterion. This is what we have to hold everything against. Does it serve the just interests of the United States? And their version of justice here being what's laid out through the rest of the document. So for Unit 13, your assessment, again, I want to stress that you're not limited to just looking at liberal groups, even though most of what we have covered in terms of youth movements are on the left. But there are conservative movements throughout this period. That might be something that you're interested in looking at. At this time, we have this big push of the counterculture. And I really wish we were doing this in class because we would listen to music and look at posters. It'd be super fun. So the counterculture is everything that's pushing against the norms. There's a counterculture today. There was a counterculture in the 90s. There's a counterculture in the 80s. Okay. It's not just one thing, it's whatever is counter, opposite, or pushing against or opposing the norms of the culture. So it's the rejection of traditional norms. What comes about during this period, referred to as the sexual revolution, looser understandings of sexual morality, different ideas of how relationships can function. Part of that is fostered through the social acceptance through the period of birth control. So there's all of that stuff that's going on, something you might want to consider for your Unit 13 assessment, looking at gender roles or relationship norms. Protest music, something that you might consider looking at for your Unit 13 assessment. Artists who are pushing back against the norms. Someone who jumps to mind to me, just because it's someone that we talked about, like Kendrick Lamar, right? Bob Dylan, who's actually from Minnesota. And then Woodstock happens in 1969. That's this poster here, and it creates this like huge social acceptance really of this music, and music is really going to start to change in part because of Bob Dylan, which would be awesome if we were in class and we could do that. Drug culture also comes out of this period. Preferably you will not focus on this for Unit 13 assessment. Let's keep it academic and appropriate. But the social acceptance, at least among the counterculture of drugs, begins to kind of fuel all of these other things. In part with LSD, which we would now refer to as acid, there are a bunch of really, like Timothy Leary's a college professor, right? Like really educated, not the normal people traditionally that you would think of as using drugs. And they are going to start kind of pushing these different agendas. There's one group that tries to use positive vibes to levitate the Pentagon, for example. It didn't go very well. They also proposed having a pig run for president, and his name was Pegasus. So, there's always something weird going on. So this is a song. The guy's name is Joe. I'll put it in here. And this is a song. It's called Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag. And I've used this most years that I've taught American history because it has kind of like a cute, jaunty tune, but the lyrics are super dark. So take a look, give it a pause, and I'll do a little analysis after. So what I hope you're noticing is just how anti-war most of Woodstock is going to be. And by this point in 1969, this is after the Tet Offensive, Martin Luther King has been assassinated by this point. Robert Kennedy has been assassinated by this point. Obviously, John F. Kennedy is gone. So there's all of these events that happen that are really going to push, especially within the counterculture, against the war in Vietnam. And he's basically saying, like, if you go to fight, like, you're probably going to die. And if you're lucky, right, this is kind of the idea. If you're lucky, you can be the first ones on your block to have your boy come home in a box. So it's very clearly anti-war. But he hits on the economic forces behind the war. He hits on Cold War fear. He hits on like masculinity, like we looked at with different pieces of propaganda in World War I and World War II. So you'll see some of the same themes over and over. So last but not least, music. If you want to look at music or some kind of like anti-war, anti-social norms, counterculture option for a Unit 13 assessment, go nuts. Not this. No, let's just not. Okay, the environmental movement is the last one that we're going to look at, and it really starts coming to the forefront with the publication of this book called Silent Spring. And I'll give you a little more information about that on the next slide. But Rachel Carson does a lot of research on pesticides, and she ends up using data to find that pesticides are actually really bad for people. And once they're sprayed, they end up in the food chain, and none of this stuff during this period was regulated. So Earth Day begins in 1970. The passage of the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Clean Water Act. So the government stepping in to provide for a cleaner environment throughout the nation. There are concerns about nuclear power and toxic waste. There's a leak at Love Canal which leaks toxic waste into the drinking water, and then 3 Mile Island, which had a nuclear meltdown. So there's all of these different elements that are tied in here. So for your Unit 13 assessment, you might want to look at anti-nuclear power or pro-nuclear power. Why limit yourself? Or any kind of environmental advocacy. So I pulled this from a retrospective looking back at Silent Spring because it's really a science book, right? And this comes from the American Chemistry Association. So they're looking at it very much from a scientific standpoint. Give it a pause, and then I'll give you a little more information. So the article emphasizes the research part, right? But here's really the crux of what it made people consider. Silent Spring brought forward important new ideas in the public mind that spraying chemicals to control insect populations can kill birds that feed on those insects, that chemicals travel not only through the environment but through the food chain, and that chemicals that don't outright kill can accumulate in fat tissues, causing medical problems later on, and that chemicals can be transferred generationally from mothers to their young. So she brings forward all of this data that really shakes people in the way that they have thought about where their food comes from, how their food has been treated. So you might want to look at anything that has to do with food for and food safety, pesticides, etc., for your Unit 13 assessment. That would be an awesome option. So I also pulled an image because this is kind of wild to me. So DDT was the main insecticide that was used, and at the time, what's great is that you can see here, powerful insecticide harmless to humans, and they're spraying it directly on this child. It's an insecticide. There were flies. Just like when you go to the beach, there are flies there, and at the time, they believed that flies passed polio. This is 1945. This is before we had a clearer understanding of where polio comes from, but also the polio vaccine. So she, in her book, argues against using these chemicals. It's harmful to birds. That's why it's called Silent Spring, that there will be a spring where there are no birds chirping. So because people were familiar with these kind of insecticides, when she brought this data forward, it really shook people up. So you have lots of options to choose from, and I hope that one of these appeals to you. Anything within the civil rights movement, student movement, women's movement, environmental movement. And then on Thursday, we're going to look at the Native American movement. You're going to do a little bit of document analysis to wrap up, which I'm really excited about too. And I hope that if you have any questions for your Unit 13 assessment, and what you might want to focus on, just make sure that it has a connection to these reform movements. If you have any questions, give me an email, and I will catch up with you on Zoom tomorrow.